I don't know if you've noticed, but we live in a world that seems like power is abused, and that is everywhere. It doesn't matter where you are. It doesn't matter what's going on, or if you're in the church or if you're in a school. It's the reality. Not only that, but we live in a world where society seems to have forgotten God. They've said no to God. And then, unfortunately, we live in a world where betrayal hits too close to home at times. And that's exactly what was going on in David's life when he was penning Psalm 52, 53, and 54, making them very applicable for us today. That was exactly what was going on to the Jews in Babylon as they were now living in exile because of their shortcomings. And so you could imagine that when they got these Psalms and they read them, that they would maybe find some hope that God is still there, even in the midst of what they were experiencing. And it just really brings to life that the fact that what Solomon said so long ago in Ecclesiastes 1, verse 9 and 10, where he says this, he says, "That which has been is what will be. That which is done is what will be done. And there is nothing new under the sun. Is there anything of which it may be said, 'See, this is new'? It has already been in ancient times before us." That's the truth. What we're experiencing today is not something new. And I tell you that because I think sometimes we think that it's unique to us, but it's not. There's people that have gone before us that have endured the same hardships that we're facing. And the God of those same people is our God who we've put our faith in, who is going to be there for us as well. And so Psalm 52 through 54, though it would have strengthened the faith of the Jewish exiles, but it's also intended to encourage us today to live faithful lives in light of what's going on. We don't want to act like it's not happening. It's there. But we don't want to get so discouraged that we do nothing. So what God is asking us is are we going to live by faith in between what's going on? And so in these three Psalms, God's going to give us some practical application and hope to show us how God is still our refuge, because it's got to start there. It's got to start there. And so what we're going to see in Psalm 52 is that Jesus is still our refuge when power is being abused. Now, Psalm 52 was tied directly to the betrayal of Doeg, the Edomite. You can read about this in 1 Samuel chapter 21 and 22. He is the guy that informed Saul that the priests were kind of taking care of David and helped him out. And so this is when Saul was pursuing David's life, wanting to take it. And Saul responded kind of in a crazy way. He had all the priests killed. Talk about abuse of power to extreme. And in the ancient Near East, what we know is that kings often would rewrite truth through a propaganda. And for them, it was power that would be what determined what truth is. Wealth also seemed to, for them, signal this divine favor in the person. So if you had wealth and you had power, you were divinely favored. Well, the interesting thing is that Psalm 52 is going to totally dismantle that worldview. Isn't that great? And it's going to remind us that God is not impressed by power. He's not impressed by status or manipulation. No, God is always going to be our refuge, no matter what's going on. And so let's start in verse 1. "Why do you boast in evil, O mighty man? The goodness of God endures continually. Your tongue devises destruction like a sharp razor working deceitfully. You love evil more than good, lying rather than speaking righteousness. Selah. You love all devouring words, you deceitful tongue." So David starts off this psalm and he reminds us of the delusional state of the wicked. They think that they've arrived. They're boasting in evil. And I just picture David sitting here reflecting on the past when he himself experienced betrayal, when evil seemed to be winning. Sound familiar? It sure seems like this could be written today. And though it wasn't written today, we have the hope of this, that it was written for today. And so what we have is God showing us how faithful he is. And so David begins with this confrontation with a man who boasts in evil. The Hebrew here, it suggests this eternal destruction through speech. That's what he was doing. He was speaking destruction. And that's what Babylon was built upon. I mean, what was the first thing that they did to those exiles? Changed their name, gave them a new language to speak, fed them from the diets of there, trying to change them. Babylon was built on propaganda and algorithms. No, it wasn't like a Facebook algorithm, but it was the same thing. They were just being repeated time and time and time again, these things. So my question to you is, what are the algorithms that you're listening to today? Because that will really, truly, dictate how you live your life. What are you hearing? What are you listening to? A lot of the algorithms sound something like this: God lost. Our gods have won. Little g gods. You see, when we see power being abused and hear that God's lost, we have to make a choice of how we're going to respond. So how will we respond? Psalm 52 reminds us that just because evil speaks loudly, it doesn't mean that it speaks with a finality. It's just really loud. You see, God has the final verdict. Jesus won. We can hope in that. And we need to remember that it's the goodness of God that endures, especially when the algorithms seem to be speaking so loudly and are always changing. It doesn't change who God is, who is the same yesterday, today, and forever. David goes on, and in verse 5 it says, God shall likewise destroy you forever. He shall take you away and pluck you out of your dwelling place and uproot you from the land of the living. Selah. The righteous also shall see and fear and shall laugh at him, saying, here is the man who did not make God his strength, but trusted in the abundance of his riches and strengthened himself in his wickedness. Could you imagine being an exile? Think you felt uprooted? Literally, you went from the safety and security of your nation to your city destroyed, your temple destroyed, and you were literally uprooted from your place of residency and put into a different place. How would you feel when you read this? This should have been hopeful, because it would remind them that they are not the plant that God removed. They may have been transplanted per se, but they're going to be called back. But it's the wicked that God uproots and casts out. Israel wasn't cast out. They were just disciplined. And even though Babylon may have looked permanent to them, God said otherwise. And when we look back at history, we see that God was true in that. It did come to fruition. Babylon is not even the Jewish land anymore. They're not there. It's gone. Their judgment and stuff is over. And this is what we need to remember when we're dealing with the algorithms, when we're dealing with abuse of power, and we're wondering why it seems that evil appears to be winning. We need to remember that God gets the final word, that God's going to judge the wicked, and that our hope is in what God shall do. That's what verse 5 said. And then in verse 8, It says, but I am like a green olive tree in the house of God. I trust in the mercy of God forever and ever. I will praise you forever because you have done it. And in the presence of your saints, I will wait on your name, for it is good. And so in the midst of all of it, David starts off by saying, but. He's saying, here's what's going to happen. In light of all that's going on in my life, and in light of all the abuse of power, in light of all that seems to be wrong, I'm going to make a decision right now. And what does he say? He says, but I am like a green olive tree. You see, what David is choosing to do is not find his identity in what the world says he should find his identity in. He finds his identity in who God says he is. And God says that he is like a green olive tree. And David says, that's who I'm going to be. You see, and this shows us that David is choosing to listen to and trust in what God says and allow that to be what helps him and strengthens him in his response. He's listening to God, not everybody else, or even his feelings. So to say I'm like a green olive tree, what he is saying is this. The olive tree is known for its longevity. I've never been to Jerusalem. One day I hope to go. If I don't, well, then I missed out on that. But I understand that there's some olive trees there that are 2,000 plus years old. Still producing fruit or olives. So David is saying this, I'm like an olive tree. There's longevity. The olive tree was what? Kind of a symbol of God's covenant. That God's covenant is long-suffering. His blessings are continual. Olive trees are useful. Right? They produce olives. I like a good olive, especially if you stuff them with garlic. Oh, that's what I'm talking about. Man, I'm hungry now all of a sudden. The jalapenos, man, I just got to keep going, right? But they're good. They're useful. Olive oil, it's good to cook with. But yet the olive tree is also something that's very stable. We can trust in what God has done and what God is doing. And David understood this. He understood that while the wicked are uprooted, the righteous are planted. And all we have to do is go back to Psalm 1, which says, blessed is the man who walks not in the counsel of the ungodly, nor stands in the paths of sinners, nor sits in the seat of the scornful. But his delight is in the law of the Lord, and in his law he will meditate day and night. He shall be like a tree planted by the rivers of water that brings forth its fruit in seasons, whose leaf also shall not wither, and whatever he does shall prosper. The ungodly are not so, but are like the chaff which the wind drives away. Therefore the ungodly shall not stand in the judgment, nor sinners in the congregation of the righteous. For the Lord knows the ways of the righteous, but the ways of the ungodly shall perish. David's saying, God, I'm going to choose to plant myself as a tree by a river. And I'm going to trust that you are going to produce fruit in its season. And so even in exile, Israel could be planted in God's covenant. Even in the midst of this crazy world, you and I can be planted in God's faithfulness. Because our hope is that even if we get geographically displaced, we are never covenantally displaced. Because God is always faithful. And so when we face abuse of power, don't envy it, don't fear it, don't imitate it, but root yourself in God's steadfast love and remember that Jesus is still your refuge. Psalm 53, what we're going to see is how Jesus is our refuge in a society that has forgotten God. Psalm 53 echoes Psalm 14. It has a couple different twists in it, but for the most part, it mimics it. And the emphasis is on a society that has forgotten God. Israel would have needed this reminder as they were in Babylon, when they were face to face with a nation that was totally anti-God, didn't want to have anything to do with God, where idolatry saturated everything. Sounds kind of familiar, doesn't it? And so David pens this. It says, to the chief musician set to Mahalah, a contemplation of David. The fool says in his heart, there is no God. They are corrupt and have done abominable iniquity. There is none who does good. God looks down from heaven upon the children of men to see if there are any who understands, who seek God. Every one of them has turned aside. They have together become corrupt. There is none who does good, no, not one. I'm thinking David was a little bit discouraged. But have you ever felt that way? You look around and all you see is wickedness and evilness, and you're like, whoa, is there anybody that does good? And I think sometimes what happens to us is when we're faced with these things, we have a hard time seeing past that. Seeing that, yes, though that may be how we feel, that's not true in the sense that God has always preserved a remnant. He hasn't conceded, he hasn't given up. Now, it's interesting because the word here for fool, it's the word Nabal, and it does not mean unintelligent. No, it means morally rebellious, or someone who lives as that God will not intervene. Let that sink in. The fool is somebody that is morally rebellious, or someone who lives as though God will not intervene. It's interesting because the word there is, in some of your Bibles, is in italics, which meant it was added to help bring clarity when it was translated. So it could read, the fool says in his heart, no, God. Meaning when God is pursuing them, what do they say to God? No, I'm not going to listen. Yeah, Babylon was brilliant as the world is today. You look at we live in a pretty amazing world. There's a lot that is like, hey, it's kind of cool. Technology in and of itself is kind of cool. It's also got its bad sides to it, right? But it's brilliant. But both are spiritually foolish because they've said no to God. They're both corrupt. Why? We're told here because no one does good. Paul would kind of repeat that same thing in Romans chapter 3. And so with societal corruption, Israel might have been tempted to think, well, maybe Babylon is stronger than the God of Israel because their gods, lowercase, seem to be stronger and seem to be winning. But Psalm 53 reminds us that Babylon was not superior, but only temporarily in control of the situation. So think about that. What's going on today doesn't mean that the world is superior. It's just temporarily in an authority that one day will be surrendered to the God of the Bible, our King of Kings and Lord of Lords, Jesus. We don't have to fear. We don't have to worry. And so this is why we should never interpret suffering as divine abandonment. It's not. Sometimes the wicked rise so that God can display his justice, and that God will always show his faithfulness in those times of wickedness. David goes on in verse 4, he says, have the workers of iniquity no knowledge, who eat up my people as they eat bread and do not call upon God? There they are in a great fear where no fear was. For God has scattered the bones of him who encamps against you. You have put them to shame because God has despised them. David, to me, makes a very interesting statement here. And I don't know if you caught it, but it just jumped out of the pages when I was reading it this week and just kind of clung to me. When he says this, he says, they are in great fear where no fear was. And I think the reason it jumped out to me is because I think many of us live in this space where we're fearful, where there was once no fear. And why is that? You see, I think some of us live in fear when we don't need to. But we live in that space because we've forgotten that God is still in control, that God is still sitting on the throne, that even though society seems to be turning its back on God, God has never turned his back on mankind. And God's still pursuing us. All we have to do is look back. And when we look back, what we will see is the stories of God's faithfulness time and time and time again. This is why our testimonies are so important. This is why we need to share our stories. This is why I'm going to ask some of you once a month probably to stand up here and share your testimony about when the gospel was good news originally for you and how is it still good news today. And I've already got a few of you in mind. And so when I talk to you today, you can't say no. Because we need to hear your story. But when we look back, we see God's faithfulness and how he's always been faithful and ever will be. You see, Babylon fell suddenly to Persia in 539 BC. Historically speaking, we can look back and see that. You see, in a godless world, remember, the proud are not as secure as they appear. And remember, what does God's word say? I think he says something about the proud, right? God despises the proud but gives grace to the humble. Humility is the key. And then in verse 6, oh, that the salvation of Israel would come out of Zion when God brings back the captivity of his people. Let Jacob rejoice and Israel be glad. Verse 6 is where David and us should live. We should live in the hope of God's salvation. Here's the beautiful thing. God is still saving souls today. People that just the day before, we might say, oh, they're wicked. Why is it that they seem to be prospering? That through circumstances and in conversations with people that God brings into their life, they may come to this place where all of a sudden they confess their sins. And God is faithful and just to forgive them of their sins and cleanse them of all unrighteousness. And they become part of the family. God is still doing that. Our hope is that God is still saving and that God is not just into reform, but redemption. He doesn't just want to change the outward expressions. He wants to change the inward heart and redeem the life. What's he redeeming? And I love what Joel says in Joel chapter 2, verse 25 through 27. It's a hope that we have. It says, so I will restore to you the years that the swarming locust have eaten, the crawling locust, the consuming locust, and the chewing locust, my great army which I sent among you. You shall eat in plenty and be satisfied, and praise the name of the Lord your God, who has dealt wondrously with you, and my people shall never be put to shame. Then you shall know that I am in the midst of Israel. I am the Lord your God, and there is no other. My people shall never be put to shame. I love that. And maybe today you're sitting back and you're like, man, I have things in my life that I feel like the locusts just came in and ate it all. God's saying this, the promise is this, I will restore those years. When, I don't know, but we can hold on to that. That's his heart. That's what he wants. You see, our hope is this. Like Israel, we can sing this song in our Babylon when we're facing the things that seem to be destroyed, where we look at the things that seem to have been ruined, whether it's from our sins or somebody else's sins. And we can step back after we sing this song and we can realize that God still restores what looks irreparable. And maybe some of you needed to hear that. Maybe there's things in your life that you're looking at and you're like, hey, God, can you ever fix this? Today what God is saying is, I'm still in the business of repairing what seems to be irreparable. You see, cultural decline doesn't equal divine defeat. Our society may be falling apart, but that doesn't mean that God lost. And know this, God is never reacting. He's always ruling. And so therefore, we can have hope, right? We can live from a place of hope. We don't have to live from a place of headlines. We have hope. And this not only shows us our need for salvation, but it's also the key to our compassion. You see, because of this reality, we can then not be shocked when the world does dumb things. You don't even have to be shocked when you do dumb things. Let that one sink in. We don't have to be shocked. Why? Because what we read here is the Bible says that no one does good. Yeah, a broken clock's right twice a day. You might get it right a couple times a day, right? But still, man, we need to have compassion. We shouldn't be shocked. Instead of judging and condemning, this gives us the freedom to love people and to be patient with them and trust that God is working in their life, that He is still restoring what seems irreparable. That even though the world may have forgotten God, Jesus still knows their name. And Jesus is still pursuing them. And Jesus is still redeeming them. And Jesus is still our refuge. And the last thing that we're going to see in Psalm 54 is that Jesus is our refuge when betrayal is close to home. You see, Psalm 54 was written when the Ziphites betrayed David to Saul in 1 Samuel 23 and chapter 26. And like David and the exiles, the pain of betrayal was familiar. Sometimes the deepest wounds come from those who are closest to us, don't they? And so David pens Psalm 54, and he says this, "Save me, O God, by your name, and vindicate me by your strength. Hear my prayer, O God. Give ear to the words of my mouth. For strangers have risen up against me, and oppressors have sought after my life. They have not set God before them. Selah." And so when David was faced with betrayal, David says something very fascinating. He says, "Save me by your name." By your name. This seems to me to be kind of a strange thing to be saved by. Like, to me, if I was there, like, God, save me by your right hook. or God, save me by dropping the hammer. No, he says, save me by your name. And what he was saying is this: God, your name represents your covenant and your character. And David is not bargaining with God. He's trusting that God's going to be himself in the situation. He's saying, save me by your name, he's saying, God, this is who you are. You're the God who saves. Help me not to forget that. Sometimes I do, especially in the midst of betrayal. But God, help me not to forget that. Help me to remember who you are, to remember your nature and what you do. You see, if we take time and pause, what we will see is this: God is not geographically confined. And for the exiles, what they would have realized is that even though their temple was destroyed and the glory of the God departed from it, God's name traveled with them to Babylon. His character and his nature went before them and was with them and was around them and behind them while they were in Babylon. And it's that same name that is with us today. He goes on in verse 4, he says, "Behold, God is my helper. The Lord is with those who uphold my life. He will repay my enemies for their evil. Cut them off in your truth. So David says, Lord, you handle my enemies. And in the midst of his betrayal, what does David do here? He chooses to draw close to the Lord, to the one who understands. He's saying, God, I know you understand betrayal. Fast forward, Jesus was betrayed by his friend. He understands that. He knew what Isaiah would pen in describing Isaiah, when Isaiah describes the suffering servant in Isaiah 53. In verses 3 through 5, we read this. It says, he is despised and rejected by men, a man of sorrows and acquainted with grief. And we hid, as it were, our faces from him. He was despised, and we did not esteem him. Surely he has borne our griefs and carried our sorrows. Yet we esteem him stricken, smitten by God, and afflicted. But he was wounded for our transgressions. He was bruised for our iniquity. The chastisement for our peace was upon him, and by his stripes we are healed. That's what David understood. That's what God wants us to understand. He wants us to know that we can be anchored in God's faithfulness. That we can be anchored even before our circumstances change. You see, we will survive times of exile and betrayal when we preach the truth of Isaiah 53 to ourselves and to our souls. God, this is who you are. This is what you know, and I'm going to trust you. I'm going to anchor myself in that. And then in verse 6, it says, I will freely sacrifice to you. I will praise your name, O Lord, for it is good. For he has delivered me out of all trouble, and my eye has seen its desire upon my enemies. And so now David gives us two I will statements that really founded his faith. And it's two I will statements that you and I can embrace. He says this, I will sacrifice and I will praise. You see, in verse 1, he prayed, God, save me. 6 verses later, what does he say? He has delivered me. Past tense. So many people say that we have blind faith as Christians, but I don't think that that's true. You see, faith is not blind. Actually, faith causes us to be able to see more. Because faith sees the glory of the future in the gloom of the present. Faith sees who God is and what God does. David chose to worship when? Before he was delivered. He chose to sacrifice when? Before victory came. You see what's going on in the world today? Doesn't have to impact our worship and our sacrifice. We can still offer sacrifices of thanksgiving. We can still sing songs of praise. You see, we don't worship God because life is easy. If so, none of us would be singing. No, we worship him because Jesus is worthy. He's worthy. And we have hope because Jesus is still our refuge. So we need to know this. Evil, it's out there. We can see it. It's not hard to see. But it's temporary. Empires rise and empires fall. But God remains the same. And his name is always with us. God sees our betrayals. And no injustice will escape him. Corruption, it's not strength. It's decay in disguise. This world's falling apart. Covenant will always outlast crisis. Crises come and crises go. We know that. But God's covenant stays the same. He is faithful through generations. We sing about that today. Being in exile did not cancel God's promises. God still loved his people. The last thing that we see is worship is a choice. It's a reminder of how songs preserved Israel when all their structures collapsed. Our conclusion needs to be this: God is still our refuge and our ever-present help in time of need. And so as the days grow darker, and they will, don't shoot the messenger. I read the end of the book. It gets worse before it gets better. Be prepared. Make a choice. But remember, the exile story and our story, remember this, that they always have been and always will be the gospel story. The gospel story where Jesus is our defender, where Jesus is our sustainer, where Jesus is our redeemer, where Jesus is our refuge.